Sapphic and Spiritual, a podcast for queer spirituality, because being queer is a spiritual path, with your host, Carly Phillips. Welcome to the Sapphic and Spiritual Podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things queer spirituality. I'm your host, Carly Phillips, and today we are talking about the concept of being queer as being a spiritual path within itself. I'm so excited for today because it's our first episode, so welcome everyone to Sapphic and Spiritual. I'm so glad you're here and on this journey with me. Today, I really would like to introduce you to the podcast before we dive into the heart of the episode, just to give you a bit of an idea of what to expect along the way. So my intention for this podcast is really to start a conversation about the intersection between being queer and spiritual, or queer spirituality as I call it. As a witchy lesbian, I've come to understand my journey of embracing my own queerness as being an inherently spiritual path. So I started to see the similarities between the path of what some would call enlightenment and the path of coming out as a lesbian. So both paths really involve a self-discovery quest that requires you to challenge societal conditioning, to face your shadows, to unconditionally love yourself, to face adversity, to develop a deep inner knowing of your truest expression of self, right? The list goes on and on. Being queer, it's nothing other than a path to love at the end of the day. And isn't love really at the core of spirituality? Or should it be, I guess I should say? Let's face it, for so many of us within the queer community, we've faced religious trauma and persecution at the expense of simply being ourselves. When we turn to spirituality, it can open up an entirely new world for us to develop our own relationship with whatever or whoever it is we consider to be the divine. But I've noticed that even within New Age spirituality, we might not always feel included in all spiritual spaces. So here's a perfect example of this. As someone who follows goddess spirituality and is a channel for the divine feminine, I literally cringe every time I hear someone within the spiritual community describe the divine feminine and divine masculine in literal terms of gender constructs. Like, in order to obtain a balanced and transformative state of being, you need a man and a woman. That's not okay. And by doing so, they don't recognize that they're leaving us out of the conversation. So ultimately, that's why I started the Sapphic and Spiritual Podcast, so we can celebrate queer spirituality and discuss spirituality within a context that resonates with our experiences as members of the LGBTQ plus community. So a little bit more about me, Carly, your host. I know I already mentioned I'm a witchy psychic lesbian, but beyond being a stereotypical black cat lesbian, as TikTok would call it, I'm also a writer. I'm a former therapist turned coming out coach, and a soon-to-be wife to my fiance, Kelly. I'm also neurodivergent. I'm an ADHDer, and I'm forever undergoing and unpacking my own healing journey, recovering from complex trauma as a result of my chaotic childhood that involved a lot of trauma from domestic violence, parental abandonment, and abuse. I came out as a lesbian later in life. I didn't officially come out until I was 32. I'm 34 now. And that has a lot to do with not only the kind of obvious trauma component within my life, but I was also raised in a devoutly Catholic family, and faith was really kind of at the center of our family growing up. And I really struggled with my sexuality as a result, based on the conditioning from the church. So I always knew I was queer since I was very young, but I truly hated myself for many, many years because I was such a people pleaser and I wanted so desperately to fit in that I just completely betrayed myself and sacrificed my own happiness just to conform. And for me, spirituality played a huge role in my coming out journey. And here's a fun story. Fun fact, I actually met my soon-to-be wife after I was in this super deep guided meditation where I was connecting with the goddess Lilith. If you're not familiar with Lilith, she was the first woman, the OG, before Eve, who refused to submit to Adam and was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And she had her whole reputation shattered, was called a demon for the rest of eternity for simply wanting to be equal to a man. So during this meditation with Lilith, I received very clear guidance to no longer deny my sexuality and to start a dating profile exclusively for women. So who knew Lilith was the great matchmaker? Thank you, Lilith. And the very next day, I met Kelly. So again, deep, deep gratitude to you, Lilith. So you might be wondering, what can I expect from this podcast? Well, as the name of the podcast implies, Sapphic and Spiritual dives deep into the realms of queer spirituality. We'll cover topics like deconstructing religion, queer joy as a form of highest self embodiment, queer deities, and queer spiritual figures throughout history, what balancing the divine feminine and divine masculine really means, and no, it has nothing to do with gender. And we'll even explore why it seems like so many lesbians identify as a witch, in case you were wondering. And along the way, we'll have some special guests join us to provide some additional magic and insight. So if you're queer, a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and have a special interest or passion for spirituality and self-help, then this is the podcast for you. My mission truly is to make spirituality inclusive and individualized to our experiences within the queer community. So I would love to hear from you. If you're listening to this and you think, hey, I've got a great topic that I'd like for you to cover, or I have an expertise in this particular area, I'd love to be a guest, please, please, please contact me. I'd love to build a queer spiritual community for us. You can email me at sapphic&spiritual@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. So new episodes will be released every Thursday. So be sure to follow the podcast and follow us on social media for updates and to stay in touch. On Instagram, you can find us under Sapphic and Spiritual. On TikTok, Sapphic and Spiritual as well. And you can also go to our website at sapphic&spiritual.com. Okay, so let's get into it. So today we're talking about being queer as being a spiritual path within itself. I'm really passionate about this topic because I truly believe that being gay and the path that it led me down to truly discover and reclaim who I am is what ultimately saved my life. And the irony in that statement is that for teenage me or 20-something-year-old me, being gay was this massive secret that I kept from pretty much everyone in my life because I viewed it as a major flaw and something to be ashamed of. As I mentioned, I grew up Catholic and experienced a lot of religious trauma in my childhood. And I'm also autistic. So as a result, I spent most of my life believing that in order to stay safe, I had to banish all of these parts of me that didn't fit in with societal standards. So masking, right? I truly believed that me being queer and neurodivergent and having intuitive abilities made me just fucking weird. And I absolutely hated myself for a major chunk of my life. I spent so many years depressed, masking, anxious, because I wasn't living my life. I was living the life I thought other people wanted me to live, and that is such a form of self-betrayal at the end of the day. I rejected myself in order to avoid the rejection of others. When I say that being gay saved my life, I didn't have a life that was my own before coming out. Having to face some rock bottom moments in my life where I realized, it's kind of me or them at this point. The masking, the pretending. It's literally killing me and robbing me of joy and a life that feels authentic and like my own. So I really had no other choice than to face these parts of myself that I rejected and to learn to love them so I could love myself and ultimately set myself free. So I guess for me, just being a lesbian and really embracing that is what led me back to myself, back to my truth. And the interesting thing about my coming out journey was that I realized as I came out as a lesbian, it gave me the courage to start to let other parts of me come out. I feel like coming out as a lesbian was the tip of the iceberg, and below that was the neurodivergent parts that just couldn't mask any longer. The intuitive parts that were so terrified of being called crazy and made to feel like an outcast for being able to sense things beyond the physical reality that we live in, right? And they were also wanting to come out. So for me, it felt like coming out of one closet meant coming out of many closets. Being gay and choosing to let other people into my truth and to be real and authentic about who I am is what gave me my life back. So when I started reflecting on the connection between my spirituality and my queerness, it hit me that my queerness is the mechanism that allowed me to embody more and more of my true essence. My queerness is what taught me the meaning of unconditional love. My queerness changed my life for the better, and it gave me a strong sense of purpose and belonging. So it led me to come to the conclusion that being queer is a spiritual path. It's like when people say after coming out, we tend to kind of make being gay our entire personality. And when we've been closeted for so long, like, fuck yeah, we do. If you're anything like me, after being closeted for decades, sometimes being gay is the one, if not only tangible part of our personality we feel like we can hold on to as we're coming out and dismantling all of the conditioning that led to closet and hide in the first place. And it kind of becomes our anchor that grounds us into the truth of who we are as we're getting to know the other parts of us that may have been hidden in this attempt to kind of fly under the radar and feel safe in society for so long. So within spirituality, we often hear conversations about awakening and embodiment. So what does that mean? So awakening being this expanded sense of consciousness and connection to not only yourself, but all that is. And then embodiment being the lived experience of aligning our soul's truth within our physical bodies, or this idea of like lived spirituality. They both share striking similarities to the process of embracing our queerness and living out our truth. So all of this reflection led me to draw the conclusion that queerness is a spiritual path. And before we go any further, I do think it's important to differentiate between religion and spirituality. When I talk about spirituality, I am not talking about it from a religious lens whatsoever. If we were to look at the dictionary defines religion as a personalized, set, or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices, the service and worship of God. Whereas the dictionary definition of spirituality is defined as relating to, consisting of, or affecting the spirit. So what does all that mean? Well, religion involves systems and institutions that directly lead to worshiping a god or gods of some sort, while spirituality is more individualized and doesn't have to follow a specific institution or worship of a deity. To kind of simplify things, I like to think of spirituality as what connects us to something greater than ourselves while simultaneously connecting us to our greatest expression of ourself. So to make it even simpler, spirituality is about finding meaning and connection. Whether you find that meaning and connection from a god or deity or through art or through breath work or nature or yoga, it doesn't matter when it comes to spirituality. That path is ours to create, whereas in religion, the path has already been paved and we're expected to follow it. So now that we've got the religion versus spirituality debate out of the way, what's a spiritual path? If I were to ask you, what's your spiritual path, what would you say? If you'd like, maybe take a moment, pause the episode, like really think about what spirituality and walking a spiritual path means to you. Because in many ways, There really is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. My spiritual path is going to likely look different from yours, but they likely will share some similarities. For the sake of speaking a common language as we continue on this journey together, we're going to say that a spiritual path is a journey of growth, self-discovery, and connection to something greater than ourselves. I like to think of a spiritual path as a labyrinth of sorts. It's not a maze with dead ends where the goal is to find the right path, but it's one path with one way in and one way out that you work through all of these exterior parts to get to the innermost center. And on a spiritual path, even what we might consider to be a wrong turn is never a dead end. It's just an opportunity for growth and knowledge. So sticking with that labyrinth metaphor here for a moment, on our spiritual paths, we start with the outermost parts of the circle, the labyrinth. So that's things like our social conditioning, family belief systems, religious conditioning, all of the environmental factors. And we work our way closer and closer to the center of the path. And that center of the labyrinth is bringing us closer and closer to our innermost truth. For me, learning to love my queerness, it was a lot like walking a labyrinth. I had to start on those outermost parts of the spiral, deconstructing and dismantling all of those beliefs and conditioning that weren't mine, that belonged to these outside external forces. And as I got closer and closer to the truth of who I was at the center, I also had to navigate my own shadow and my own mindsets and beliefs that kept me closeted and trapped. So, like a labyrinth, a spiritual path is one that grows us and shows us the way to our core and the way to our truth. So, there are countless of characteristics of what makes a journey a spiritual path. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus on 5 qualities and talk about how they relate to coming out as queer and embodying our queerness. So here are the 5 points we're going to talk about today. Number 1 is a search for meaning. Number 2 is growth and transformation. Number 3, values and virtues. 4, love and compassion. And finally, number 5, community and connection. Okay, so number 1, the first quality of a spiritual path that proves being queer is also a spiritual path in itself, is a search for meaning. So ultimately, we turn to spirituality as a way to find meaning. Queer or not, since the dawn of time, humans have been trying to make sense of why we're here and what our purpose is. And it's very much part of our humanness to look for answers to our origin. And in terms of queer spirituality, I like to think of this as our gay awakening. Regardless of how old we are, we start to recognize attraction to someone outside of the heteronormative world, and we immediately are left to make sense of it. For me, I would say that one of my earliest gay awakening moments, this is going to sound so ridiculous, but it was actually a cast member on the MTV show Road Rules from like back in, I think it was 2002, 2003, something like that. I was 13 years old, and there was a cast member on the show named Rachel. At this point, I had already started to notice that I liked girls in a way that I didn't see my friends liking girls. So I just thought I was weird. Until I was watching this episode of Road Rules, and the cast member Rachel comes on and says she's bisexual and is dating a woman. For a 13-year-old me in that moment, I felt like I had found meaning. I had zero exposure to any other queer women in my life. I didn't know any queer women in real life. I didn't have models of what that meant or what that looked like. And I had only ever heard the term lesbian be used in a derogatory way. So when I heard the term bisexual, I was like, oh, I'm going to cling to this. Like, maybe this is what I am. And just this one small glimpse of representation at 13 made me believe that I was bisexual for almost 20 years, simply because I felt like I could relate to this person who identified as bisexual because I felt like she looked like me. She just felt more similar to me, right? Even though I'm actually a lesbian. But at 13, that's what I held on to. And that really speaks to just how desperate I was to find answers and meaning to who I was. Living in a heteronormative world, in a lot of ways, we have to get super meta from a young age because we recognize there's something different about us. And that alone leads us to search for meaning. We start to wonder, what does it all mean for us? And it really does lead us to reflect on our identity and our place in the world in this much deeper level. And the meaning that we put on our queerness, it has massive implications for how we see ourselves and our ability to love ourselves for who we are. So meaning is huge. If we, like I did for a long time, determine the meaning of our queerness to be shameful, we become ashamed of who we are. On the contrary, if the meaning we place on our queerness is that it's a gift and something to celebrate, that meaning frees us and can bring us a lot of joy. Okay, number 2, growth and transformation. So take a moment and think about who you were before coming out and who you are now. That person's pretty different, aren't they? The act of coming out is like a massive growth point for queer people. Think about all the work you did from self-discovery to thinking about how you were going to tell people to coming to terms with the possibility of losing people in your life just for being you. All that work you did, all the inner work to get to the point of even coming out, that changes you. That grows you. That transforms you. And then there's actually being out. Like all of that growth comes from living visibly as a queer person in the world. I definitely feel like the process of coming out for me was by far the greatest growth moment in my life. And this is coming from someone who spent like literal decades in therapy. Talking and processing, that's all one thing, but actually facing my biggest fear of living in the world as me. The me that I thought was broken and would just forever be rejected, that's where the real growth really happens for me. Because that's when I realized like, oh shit, I'm really brave. I'm really strong. I might just actually like who I am. Coming out and owning my identity as a lesbian woman, that empowered me like nothing else in my life has. And again, empowerment and growth, those are all part of a spiritual journey. All right, number 3 of qualities that correlate with both the spiritual path and queerness is values and virtues. So on the spiritual path, we start to recognize that there's values that become characteristics of the journey itself. So some common ones are things like compassion, honesty, integrity, and they become the foundation of how we choose to live our lives and interact with the world. For me, my coming out journey was really propelled by this choice I made within myself to live from a place of integrity. I started to see how the values of society that I was so heavily indoctrinated in weren't my actual beliefs. I really had to take a step back and consider like, okay, is this the truth of the world I live in, or is this my own truth? The more and more I reflected on that, I realized that a lot of the societal values I was brought up to believe, especially around what made someone successful, weren't actually in alignment with my own beliefs, nor were they even healthy for me. I think a big one and a good example of this is the idea of hard work. If you're anything like me, you probably grew up with this concept that hard work mattered above everything else. In my family, it was like wearing this badge of honor to go to work sick. It was like showing the world how tough you are. I remember as a kid, if I was sick, I wasn't even allowed to just like stay home from school. I had to go and give it a try. And then if I really didn't feel good, then I could come home. Work and productivity were taught to me as being what mattered most. And this idea that how others perceive you and your ability to deny the needs of your own body to maintain a certain level of productivity as being the most important thing you can do, yeah, like that is absolutely not what I believe in. In fact, this was really harmful for me as a kid growing up with undiagnosed autism because it pushed me into burnout. And it made me develop a level of distrust within my body that now when I get sick, I go into a full-blown meltdown every time I'm sick because I feel like I can't trust my body to know if I'm really sick, or should I just like push through this like I was taught. So circling back to integrity and values and how this all relates to being queer, my coming out journey is what really forced me to get clear about what really mattered to me, what values were actually mine, and what were just some bullshit patriarchal conditioning that was harmful and needed to be reevaluated. So being queer and coming out as a lesbian, it completely reshaped what I considered to be my values. Integrity is number one for me. I really do try to ask myself when I'm facing something challenging or if I'm getting that gut feeling like something is off, I ask myself, is this within my integrity? Is this aligned with my truth? And if it's not for me. So I think in some ways my queerness helped me create this kind of roadmap for how I interact with the world and make decisions about where I belong in the world and what is for me in the world based on my inner integrity. And that leads us to our fourth characteristic of what defines a spiritual and queer path, and that's love and compassion. So within any spiritual path, love and compassion are, or I should say claim to be, within the core doctrine. So we see this in religion too, with Jesus preaching to love your neighbor as yourself, for example. From a law of attraction lens or New Age spirituality, there's this idea that emotions carry different levels of vibrational frequencies. So emotions like joy and love carrying a higher frequency than more dense emotions like guilt or shame. So operating from these higher frequencies is said to attract more of what we want in life and creates a more balanced and positive state of being. So the power of love and the magic that comes from love is something we really can't escape. I mean, look at rom-coms. There's always this like serendipitous and magical component to them that is always fueled by love. So love is huge. Love is really a catalyst for transformation and joy and connection. And at the end of the day, isn't being queer really all about love? It's kind of like this two-part path to love. It's like the old cliche and overused saying that goes, we have to love ourselves before we can fully love others. Well, there's truth to that. If we're ashamed of our sexuality, if we're surrounding ourselves with people who make us feel like outcasts for being queer, that all directly impacts our ability to love ourselves. I feel like self-love for me has been one of the hardest parts of my journey. The layers of shame and masking to fit in were so fucking deep that like peeling back layers on an onion, the more and more I peeled back, the more I realized I was being completely inauthentic to what my soul really wanted for my life. That it felt like, not that it felt like, it was a full-blown identity crisis for me at times. It was like, okay, so here I am, I'm purging all of these identities and beliefs that aren't mine, that were all conditioned, but what's left? Like, what is left beyond all of that? Who am I beyond all of that? So that process of learning to love myself again, it was quite the task. Because I had to figure out who I actually was. And to be completely honest, I'm still learning that. You know, it makes so much sense that the denser, lower vibrational emotions like shame and guilt fall at the opposite end of the spectrum of the higher vibrations of emotion like love and peace, because it's through transmuting the shame that we find love. And ultimately, I truly do believe that life is an entire existence of contrast. Earth is the planet of contrast and polarity, and we aren't going to escape that. It's impossible. So Learning to love myself as a lesbian, to love those parts of me that I hid for so long because I knew damn well society didn't love them, to me, that's alchemy. That's shadow work. That meets criteria for so many spiritual practices. And then part 2, loving others. What ignites us on this journey to self-love is love itself. It's understanding that what love and intimacy looks like for us is different from the heteronormative world we live in. So at the core of it all, it's a quest for love. And that's really fucking beautiful. That love is the driving force that brings us to ourselves and allows us to find love and to actually receive love. When I think about all the years I spent closeted, dating men, and even being engaged to a man at one point, what upsets me the most is how I really missed out on love. When Kelly, my fiance, came into my life, she really showed me that I had absolutely no idea what love was before. I mean, there's the obvious part that is because I was a lesbian in relationships with men, so the intimacy just wasn't there. But also, I never got to experience love and see what real unconditional love is. And it's the most incredible thing on this planet. To have Kelly love me through all my meltdowns, all my trauma, all the raw and messy parts of me, that's what's also helped deepen my love for myself, seeing that mirrored back to me, that I'm deserving of that. But in my relationships with men, I was never able to be myself because I was always in hiding. And there just obviously never would be that potential for my true self to shine through and to be vulnerable because it was all a mask. It was all a protective shield that really didn't actually protect me. It just kept me living in shame and fear and pushing me further and further away from love. So really, at the end of the day, I see being queer as kind of the ultimate path to love, to self-love, and ultimately finding a deep and intimate love. All right, our last quality of a spiritual path that relates to queerness is community and connection. So within spiritual paths, there's always the obvious element of connection to something greater than yourself, and that usually involves a community of support of others who share similar values and beliefs. Well, wouldn't you know that as queer people, we have our own built-in community, the LGBTQ plus community, and that community of people who get it, people who know what it's like to exist in this world as a queer person, that is one of the most validating feelings I found. Even if it's just an online community, the support we have available to us within the queer community is what gets so many of us through the hard transitions of coming out. The saying, "it takes a village," yeah, it really does. There's shared experiences, there's shared wisdom, there's support, there's guidance. We gain so much from community. And from a spiritual perspective, that's really why we're here, to be in community. And we literally need connection as humans. Connection is vital. It's just as important as food, water, shelter. Connection directly influences our well-being. And that goes both ways. Positive connections are going to make us stronger and healthier, while negative connections, they keep us living in that shame place. And they keep the masks on far longer. So I feel like the beautiful community we have as queer people is in a lot of ways what connects us to something greater than ourselves. Within our community, we have the power to make the world a better place by advocating for LGBTQ plus rights, for ensuring there is representation and resources for queer youth, and many more. I also believe that it's inherently spiritual to advocate for human rights. In my opinion, the whole point of spirituality should be centered around trying to leave the world a little better of a place than we found it. And being queer gives us a built-in community that can empower us to make change, not only for our community, but for the world. It's like Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the great voices of the civil rights movement, said, "No one is free until everyone is free." And as queer people, we know exactly what that means. And we take it into our own hands to help spread awareness and activism for the freedom of all. Freedom for Palestine, right? out of our own adversities, we recognize and we fight for global change. And that is part of the spiritual path. It's fighting for something bigger than us. It's fighting for all. And I think that's one of the things that makes me feel the most proud of being queer and being a part of this community is the legacy that we're able to create and leave behind for humanity. So I'd like to leave you with a quote today by Carl Jung, who said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you really are." And I think being queer gives us the ability to do just that. And that ultimately is a spiritual path, the path back home to ourselves.